On September 16, 1974, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger's plane arrived at Cairo International Airport. The visit was very strange and illogical because it was the first American visit to Egypt since the October War of 1973. This means relations between the two parties were not good. However, just 3 days before the visit, suddenly and without reason, the United States decided to reconcile with Egypt, and there was no announced reason. American statements claimed they needed to visit the region and that there was no problem between them and Egypt, and that Egypt was always dear to them. Of course, this talk was not true and was nonsense because behind this visit there was a much bigger reason than you can imagine. The important thing is that Egyptian President Anwar Sadat met with the U.S. Secretary of State in the city of Aswan, Egypt. At the end of the meeting, Henry Kissinger very shyly told Sadat that they had a small request. They wanted the release of a 27-year-old detainee they had, who was considered very gentle and innocent, to return her to them. But Sadat very calmly told him that unfortunately she had been executed and everything was over. At this sentence, the visit ended and Kissinger returned, thinking that the detainee had indeed died. But let me surprise you and tell you that the girl had not been executed and was alive at that moment, and the details that happened before her execution and the way she was executed are stranger than you can imagine. If you like spy and investigation movies and series, police intelligence, and stories where one side is smart and the other is cunning, I promise you today's story, no matter how much we talk about it, we won't do it justice. And this time, our story is different. It happened here in the Arab world, not in Europe or the United States. So, I want you to pay very close attention and listen to the details of the smartest plan to catch the most dangerous spy in Arab history. Today's story will be about Hiba Syed, the smartest and most dangerous spy ever revealed and known in Egyptian history. On July 13, 1947, a girl named Hiba was born in Egypt. This girl was not like any other girl. She came from a wealthy family and lived a life full of luxury and details that only 1 in 1,000 Egyptians experienced at that time. Hiba is the daughter of Abdel Rahman Syed Amr, who, along with his family, was among the prominent and wealthy figures of the Sahel Salim area in Asyut Governorate in Upper Egypt. At that time, social class dominated the countryside in the Arab world, meaning the rich stayed rich and the poor continued to work for the rich.
NANI?!
Since Hiba's father was one of the prominent figures in the city, there is no need to explain the extent of their wealth and the luxurious life Hiba lived. If you are surprised that I am focusing on their wealth and Hiba's luxurious life, you will soon understand why, and you will realize that money is not everything in the world. One day, Abdel Rahman, Hiba's father, decided to move to the capital, Cairo. He joined political and government work, and his plan was to combine wealth and power. He had wealth from his trade inside and outside the country and from the large inheritance he received from his family. The inheritance was so large that he had entire villages working under his command. So, the only thing left for him was to acquire power, and he achieved this through his vast connections. Indeed, from his first visit to Cairo, he was appointed as the Deputy Minister of Education in Egypt. Some sources say that he was initially a government employee and rose through the ranks until he reached his position. However, in reality, his first appointment was to this position primarily due to his connections and, secondly, his educational background. Of course, there is no source or evidence explaining who helped him and how he was able to reach this sensitive position so easily. The important thing is that Abdel Rahman gained much more power and influence than he ever dreamed of, and he moved to live with his family in the Mohandesan neighborhood of Cairo, which was considered one of the most prestigious neighborhoods in Egypt at that time. At that time, Heba was only 13 years old, and she moved from her rural life in her father's palace to live in the most prestigious neighborhoods of Egypt. She joined the neighborhood club, which had sports, activities, and parties that no other Egyptian knew at that time. She continued like this until 1965. By then, Heba was 18 years old, and of course, all the elements of success were available to her. She succeeded in high school and decided to study at Cairo University and enter the Faculty of Arts, French Language Department. This language would later become a curse for her. Heba was one of the top students in college, and when she graduated, she was the second in her class. Here, her life took a turn and led her to something she had never imagined. Now, our story full of surprises and events begins. I want to tell you something small. Remember it well because we will come back to it later. When Heba entered university, like any girl from the upper class, she left the old club in the Mohandesan neighborhood and joined a new club called Jazeera Club. Parties, friends, trips, and her life were perfect in every sense of the word, with nothing annoying in it except for one thing. There was someone always stuck to her and wouldn't leave her alone. He was a source of annoyance for her. She tried to avoid him and get rid of him in every possible way, but she couldn't. Throughout her time at the club, he kept trying to get close to her, but she didn't like him or accept him. This person was an engineer officer in the Egyptian commandos named Farouk El-Fiki. Despite his position, he never gave up and kept pursuing her throughout her studies, but she never paid him any attention. Remember the name Farouk well, because he is the main trouble in our story. Let's leave him aside for a bit and return to Heba, who graduated in 1969. As we said, Heba was the second in her class, and due to her distinction and unparalleled presence, the head of the French language department at Cairo University, who was of French origin and a delegate from the French Sorbonne University, offered her a scholarship on behalf of the Sorbonne University. Of course, this was impossible for several reasons. First, the scholarship was only for the top student, not the second. Also, despite all the luxurious details of her life, Heba came from an original Upper Egyptian family, and her family would never allow her to travel alone. However, the professor contacted the university and managed to get an exception for Heba to be able to travel. He also requested to meet her father to convince him. Indeed, after a lot of pressure, her father agreed on the condition that she would live with his friend and colleague's family who were residing in France. This colleague's name was Omar Galal Hussein. And indeed, Heba traveled, and the strange and unexpected events began with her. The day after Heba arrived in France, she met by chance a girl of Polish origin named Natasha. This girl became her closest and only friend as well. Of course, if you look into the sources, you won't find anything confirming whether the meeting between Heba and Natasha was planned or happened by chance. It is not known. But let me tell you something and ask anyone who has traveled and been away from their family. When someone travels and knows they will be away from their family for a long time, they start to feel a big emptiness, nostalgia for their country, friends, family, and everything they were used to. This emptiness can be filled by anyone, and usually the first person you meet abroad who is kind to you fills this emptiness. This is why we hear many stories of fraud and deception that happened to migrants or students who went to study and then returned to their countries. The important idea I want to convey to you is that Heba wrote in her memoirs that her Polish friend Natasha compensated her for her family and was always with her. They went to student parties every day, and these parties and the atmosphere were the reason for filling the big emptiness left by her father inside her. The surprise information I left for you is that Natasha was not just Polish, she was also Jewish, and here you start to understand the game. For 6 months, Natasha took Heba and they went together to an educational center called Peace for God's People on Earth. And from its name, you must have figured out what the center's role is. In short, its role was to talk about the charitable work done by Israel, how it loves peace and aspires for it, and that Arabs hate humanity and ways must be found to stop the injustice and establish peace in the region. Not only that, but Natasha also showed her videos and pictures from within the entity, showing how the area was before the entity developed it and how it became after. There is no need to explain to you how the girl's brain was washed to the extent that she wrote in her memoirs that she hated her Arab origins. Why? Because of the brutality in Arab history and societies as well. Imagine to what extent her thinking reached. The funny thing is that she always remembered her father's sentence, who used to tell her, "We are people of money and influence, not people of wars. So be like your father and throw everything behind you and focus on money and power." However, her father's advice did not benefit her as she walked a path unlike any other. Once, at one of the parties, there was a handsome young man sitting at the table with Heba and Natasha. The man was candid and politely introduced himself, saying he was an Israeli student of French origin. He told her about his new affiliation and how beautiful Israel is, and how he and his fellow countrymen dream that the brutal Arab view will change and everyone will live in peace. Brothers, they've always been liars, and I think the days we're living in have proven to the whole world who is truly brutal and sick. Anyway, from a nice conversation filled with love and compassion, they moved to talk about love and precious relationships. Heba, with all disgust, told him about an Egyptian officer who used to chase her at the Jazeera Club. And who was this officer? Farouk El-Fiki, whom I told you to remember. Here, the Israeli student's facial expressions changed, realizing he had a treasure in his hands. He said, "There's no need for a long conversation and explanation, let's get straight to the point." He asked her for the officer's name and if she knew his specialization. Indeed, she gave him his name and said he was an engineer officer in the Egyptian commandos. The young man was overjoyed and told her, "Tomorrow we will meet at the cultural center and have a long talk." Indeed, the next day Heba went to the center and met the young man. He told her that he was not a student or anything, but an officer in the Israeli Mossad, and he wanted her to be his partner in the most noble operation they would undertake together. He told her that the two of them would be the reason for declaring peace in the entire region. With a few kind and deceitful words, he managed to deceive a girl who was no older than 25 years. Over several sessions, Heba was convinced of the idea and told him, "I am ready for any mission." At this point, Heba moved to a higher level than the cultural center and was trained by 4 Israeli officers on many things. They trained her on secret ink, sign language, how to operate and use the transmission device, several codes, and visual messages. When she became ready for the operation, they asked her to go on vacation to Egypt. They told her to go immediately to the Jazeera Club and meet with Officer Farouk Abdel Maguid El-Fiki in any way, because he served in the missile forces of the Egyptian commandos. This meant he was an invaluable treasure. Of course, they didn't just teach her how to deceive him and extract information from him. They also taught her how to recruit him for the Israeli Mossad and the best time to offer him the biggest financial offer he could ever get in his life. Indeed, the next day, Heba went on vacation, and after a 3-day search, she met Farouk, and the two started a one-sided love story. The plan was for Heba to show her strong personality and knowledge in front of Farouk and always focus on his weaknesses without him realizing it. She deliberately used many French words he didn't know to show the cultural distance between them. Every time they sat together, She would speak 20 or 30 strange words, and even when she translated these words, she did so in a superior and condescending manner to make him feel inferior and inadequate. Not only that, she would tell him about things she did in France that were not available in Egypt to make him feel the class difference between them. Everything she wore and displayed in front of him, she would tell him its price to make him thirsty for money and keep feeling inadequate and inferior to her wealth. She focused on his dark skin color and height, highlighting the difference between him and Western youths and how superior their beauty was. Of course, she did this for the same reason and goal. Heba continued this behavior for 7 days, and as a natural and instinctive reaction in a man, he would try in every way to prove his strength and impress the girl he loves. Therefore, there is no need to tell you that there wasn't a single military secret he didn't tell her. He wanted to show off, and of course the mouse fell into the trap, and it became possible to extract any information from him. Heba decided that their meetings should be held in a secret apartment in the Mahdi area, and they started meeting there. Farouk would talk, and Heba would tell him, "Wow, you were very strong." He told her about his fellow officers' names, guard deployments, and border patrols. When she doubted him about something, he would bring her a map the next day to prove he was telling the truth, to the extent that once she asked him to bring her a map of the border air defense missiles, and without being suspicious of the request or thinking about it, the next day he brought her a map. Some sources say and confirm that he took large sums of money from her, and Heba spent on him all in the name of love. That's why he couldn't refuse her any request. They continued this way until the day she told him everything and offered him to help her and be her partner in stopping the war. In return, they would give him French citizenship along with financial sums and privileges he had never dreamed of. Unfortunately, Farouk agreed, and circumstances had it that during this period, he received a promotion and became the director of the office of the commander of the Egyptian commandos, Brigadier General Nabil Shukri. There is no need to tell you what information he leaked because nothing was left unknown to the entity, from the names of officers to all the weapons available and all the plans, to the extent that Farouk was so devoted that Heba returned to France because our man had completed and fulfilled everything. There was no need for her to stay with him. She gave him the transmission device and told him to continue because he had already surpassed her and left her no role. Indeed, the man did not fall short. At that time, Egypt was preparing for the October War. They were setting up Soviet air defense missile bases along the border with the entity. The strange thing was that every time the commandos started preparing the sites, the entity's air force would come out and bomb the bases without any evidence or indication that missiles were going to be placed there. This continued for an entire year, resulting in many martyrs and significant losses of time, effort, and costs for Egypt. Here, the Egyptian military intelligence entered the war to uncover who the traitor was. Focus with me, because things are about to heat up, and all the good events are here. The first thing the military intelligence did was issue contradictory plans. Each plan was given to a specific group of officers, and they monitored from afar to see what would happen. Every time one of the plans leaked, the entity would know about it. After 3 months of monitoring, the Egyptian military intelligence became sure that the traitor was not an ordinary person. The traitor was a high-ranking officer from the top ranks, and most importantly, he served in the commandos. Here, Officer Fuad Mahmoud Nassar, head of the Egyptian military intelligence, decided to personally supervise the investigation after seeing that President Sadat was very upset about the matter. He supervised the investigation because of his strong relationship with this agency and knowing most of the officers in it. Brothers, can you imagine the situation? A young girl of 25 years old had occupied a great country like Egypt. Of course, all the officers, especially the commando officers, were monitored in all their movements. The process of narrowing down the possibilities continued until they reached the missile brigade of the commandos. They were sure that the traitor was an officer in the commandos. Here, listen and focus well on what happened. During the investigation period, all the commando officers were monitored and everything, including the messages they sent and received. Intelligence officers were responsible for opening and resealing the messages without showing any sign that anyone had opened or seen their contents. This means that the intelligence was monitoring the commando officers' messages without them knowing. In 1972, among all the messages, there was a message sent by an Egyptian officer to an Egyptian girl he loved who was in Paris. Of course, this was not the first message he sent her, but the strange thing about this message was one sentence at the end of the letter. He wrote to her, "And finally, I installed an aerial, which is the receiving device, and the radio worked at my house." Of course, if this message had been sent 5 years earlier, it would have been normal and no one would have paid attention to it. However, the strange thing was why this officer was installing a radio receiver at a time when television had entered every home. And since he was an officer with good financial status, why was he so happy about the radio that he had to tell the girl he loved about it? The important thing is, without introductions, they searched for his identity and found out that he was Engineer Officer Farouk Abdel Maguid El-Fiki. The surprise was that he worked as the director of the office of the Egyptian Commandos commander, Brigadier General Nabil Shukri, meaning from the same agency the intelligence suspected. Indeed, within hours, Farouk was in prison, and there he saw stars in broad daylight and simply confessed to everything. The matter remained secret to the extent that the intelligence agency sent messages to Hiba to keep things normal, but they were preparing for a fantastic operation. Here we enter the best part of the story. After Farouk was arrested and the news reached President Anwar Sadat, he issued a highly responsible and serious order to arrest Hiba in any possible way. Indeed, the Egyptian intelligence started studying Hiba to know how to deal with her and bring her in quietly without the Israelis knowing, in the same way they brought in Farouk El-Fiki. After only 20 days, they began executing the plan. Look at the game that's happening at the beginning of the video. I told you about Abdel Rahman Syed Amr, Hiba's father, who I said was very rich and the most important thing for him in the world was money and influence. This man, after Hiba traveled, left the ministry and traveled to Libya because the work there was good. Libya was experiencing a period of incredible economic growth. The man left the ministry and all the power and went to work to gather some good money. This man was Hiba's weak point because it was clear that Hiba did not agree with her mother or her only brother, and there were always problems between them, unlike her relationship with her father, who was everything to her. He was the only person who could bring in Hiba. But how? A person with no principles or conscience and nothing matters to him in the world other than his pocket. How would they convince him? Let's say he was a patriotic person? Surely he wouldn't hand his daughter over to the intelligence because he knew her fate would be execution. However, the Egyptian intelligence had the solution. Initially, there was coordination at the highest level of secrecy between Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Libyan President Muammar Gaddafi. In the next phase, Egyptian and Libyan intelligence worked on the matter and started the plan. The plan was for the Egyptian ambassador in Libya, Fakhri Osman, to go and meet Hiba's father. Of course, he didn't tell him that his daughter was a spy. He told him the opposite. He told him that his daughter belongs to the Palestinian Liberation Organization and is currently planning to carry out a suicide attack in France, and we want to find a way to bring your daughter back here and save her from their hands to be safe. Hiba's father told them, "I am ready to do whatever you want. The important thing is for my daughter to be safe." The ambassador told him, "That's great. That's 50% of our job done, and the plan is now in place. I will tell you what we need to do. We will put you in a medical emergency situation in the hospital, and you will contact your daughter Hiba, telling her that you had a heart attack and you feel like you are living your last days, and that your last wish or request in life is to see your daughter before you die. If she tells you to come to France, or it is difficult for her to come down or anything, you will tell her you are dying and it is impossible for you to travel anywhere. Indeed, Egyptian and Libyan intelligence executed the plan in detail. They put Hiba's father in a medical emergency situation in the hospital, and all the reports and tests confirmed that his health was at risk and that he had only hours left to live. He contacted his daughter and told her all this. Despite her trying in every possible way to convince him to come to her, he told her it was impossible for him to travel. So, she had no choice but to go down to Libya. She immediately contacted the Mossad and informed them of the matter. On the same day, they confirmed the matter to her and told her that her father was indeed in the hospital and his health condition was severe. They tried in every way to convince her not to go to her father, but she refused since she was sure the matter was true. Before she traveled, they told her that when her plane arrived at Tripoli airport, she should shout at the top of her voice that her ring worth $1 million was stolen. This way, if Egyptian intelligence was behind the matter, they couldn't show themselves because the Libyan police would intervene and look for the ring. Therefore, no one could approach her because she would be in the custody of the Libyan police until the report was written and they pursued the matter. During this time, she could ensure if anyone was monitoring her or if there was a plan. But who are you fooling? Egyptian and Libyan intelligence were working together on this, so no matter what she did, it wouldn't help. Indeed, Hiba's plane arrived and she did what they told her to do. Ambassador Fakhri Osman welcomed her, and the two sat in the airport's VIP lounge until things calmed down or they resolved the ring issue. The session was friendly, and there was nothing strange to the extent that Hiba used the telephone booth at the airport and told the Mossad agent that everything was fine. The ambassador welcomed her, and they drank juice, and there was nothing to be afraid of. She finished the call, and the ambassador told her, "Please, let's go and visit your father." Instead of leaving the airport to meet her father, they returned to the runway, and Hiba saw the plane waiting for her, and standing at the plane's stairs were Egyptian officers. In a moment, Hiba was on the plane. The flight took off from Tripoli to Cairo and directly to the intelligence branch. To make a long story short, like Farouk, she immediately confessed to everything. She was sentenced to death by hanging, and Farouk was sentenced to death by military firing squad. Here, after the death sentence was issued for both, the Prime Minister of the entity contacted the US President and asked him to intervene to get Hiba out of prison. If the entity abandoned Hiba, it would shake its image in front of all the spies they recruited, and they would realize how cheap they were and see their end. Therefore, the entity had to keep them deluded that they were important and would not abandon them. At the beginning of the video, if you remember, I told you that Kissinger came to Egypt and asked for Hiba, but Sadat told him that she was already executed and it was done. However, Hiba was alive in Al-Qanater prison, waiting for the entity to come and get her out. When the meeting between Kissinger and Sadat ended, and before Kissinger left Aswan Palace, Sadat whispered in his deputy's ear to order the immediate execution of Hiba and Farouk. Indeed, Hiba was quickly transferred from Al-Qanater prison to the Court of Cassation prison in Cairo, where the execution was carried out. Hours later, Farouk was executed by firing squad. Among the people who participated in shooting Farouk was Brigadier General Nabil Shukri, who considered Farouk's betrayal a stab in the heart of the commandos. As for the point I told you we need to stop at and focus on, it's that money doesn't always make a person betray their country. Hiba and other spies came from very wealthy families, and the entity was to brainwash them with a few pictures and videos, just like they tried to do today with the whole world. So, understand the game and be sure that even if the methods change, the idea is always the same. Their job is to distort and spoil.